Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Neil Thomas. This is my co-host, Kevin James.
Thank you, Neil. In this podcast series, we chat to improvisers about their practices, their histories, their conceptualizations, and their aspirations, and more.
Today, it gives us great pleasure to be in conversation with Olivia Millard. We learn how foundational scores are to her teaching and improvising. We get a rare glimpse of her scorebook, and we hear how practice is central for improvisers.
Olivia also spoke of inclusivity in her research on the AllPlay Dance program, spoke of habit as an improviser's ally, and the importance of a rigorous practice.
Good morning, Olivia Millard. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Improvisers podcast this afternoon. Let's just jump straight in and tell us about you and improvisation, when you started and why.
Hello. Hi, Kevin. Hi, Neil. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you. So I've been improvising for quite a long time now, I guess. I started, I guess, in the usual way. So I did an undergraduate degree at Victorian College of the Arts in the early 90s. And so improvisation was part then of our curriculum, I guess, and part of generating movement in various collaborative processes or choreographic processes. Following my time at VCA, I worked in a couple of companies. So I worked in a company in Perth called 2Dance Plus for a few years, and I worked in Melbourne at DanceWorks, where Sandy Parker was the artistic director. So there was a bit of improvisation in and amongst that work, but I guess I felt there was quite of a shift for me in terms of thinking about improvisation as my primary practice. I kind of had two main influences, I guess. And the first was actually when I was working with DanceWorks. Ros Warby came and made a work with the group, and she had very recently been working with Deborah Hay, on and off. And she made a work on us, with us, really, that was improvised. And that was the first time that I had performed a work that was fully improvised. And it just kind of lit something up in me. I felt like the possibility to really find something in the present of performance, and all of those rehearsals, I found such joy in that process. And I kind of found almost like a kooky side of myself that didn't exist. I think I had thought of myself as a very serious dancer trying to be good. And so it felt freeing, but it felt exciting. And following that time, I went kind of back into working really with a lot of set material. So I worked with a lot of different choreographers in Perth, Sue Peacock mainly, but I made a lot of my own work, and a lot of that was set as well. And then, so it would have been, let's say, around about 2004, I did a workshop with Rosalind Crisp, and that was the first time I had met Ros. And it was a week-long workshop, and she was over in Perth for a festival called Dancers as Space Eaters. I had work in that festival, and I took that workshop, and I guess kind of after that, I didn't look back, if that makes sense, So I do have an ongoing relationship with Ros, and she's been a huge influence on me, but I really, it's like I took up that kind of spark, I suppose, that I'd found working with Ros Warby, and started to kind of think of myself in a slightly different way, I guess. Following that time, I moved back to Melbourne with my family, including my young daughter, and I started working at Deakin University, and I still work here now. And then I decided, so I'd been teaching at WAPA in Perth for about 7 years, and I decided, I think I might go into university teaching. And then it became clear to me that I needed to do further study. So I did an honours year, and in that year I did a project which was really looking at the relationship between set and improvised movement material. And so I played a lot with, how set material might fall into improvised material. And following that year, I started a PhD, and my PhD was really about improvisation. So I left behind, I guess, that investigation of set material and did a 3-year project. I had a group of dancers who worked with me twice a week for 3 years. And at the end of that time, my kind of outcome was a line in the sand, I guess. Well, my question really was about whether we made a work, but we showed something which was the end point of that 3 years of research, I guess. And I suppose, that was 2011, I think that worked. So that's now more than 10 years ago. And I just haven't really looked back. Improvisation really drives almost all of my dance practice now.
In your bio, you actually speak about scores and the use of scores. And I'm always really intrigued about improvisation and the implementation of scores and the way scores might scaffold what we do, or or others might sort of feel scores get in the way of, or a more immediate availability to anything that might emerge. I'd love it if you'd talk a little about your interest in scores and the way you see the relationship between scores and improvisation.
Yeah, thank you. So scores were really part of that PhD research. So I knew scores, I guess, as a term that I had encountered working with other people in the studio. The term, I guess, was a verbally shared, I guess, a term shared in practice. So then I kind of looked back into all of the literature I could find about scores. I looked at the theory of scores, and I won't bore anybody by talking about the theory, but really theory of scores by Nelson Goodman, so a 1968 text. And then I went, all the way through to looking quite carefully at what improvisers who had documented their kind of thinking about what scores were, and used that as a way, while concurrently working on my own practice, used that as a way to kind of figure out what scores meant for me. So I deliberately use the term scores because I guess I have named what I use as scores, kind of sitting in that field, if that makes sense. So for me, scores are they're the enabling of possibility. They're propositions. They are a holding. They are almost like a ruse, a kind of a pretense to give us something to hold on to in order to generate in the present. And for me, they're words, and they're delivered usually verbally. And so I have a practice which is a weekly practice. And so since my PhD, I've had this Friday morning practice every week. So I have a group practice, and I have dancers who come and join me every week. And we didn't do it during COVID, but other than that, we've been working every Friday for a long time. The dancers have changed in that time. 1 or 2 dancers have come and go. So we have some people who've been working with me for 10 years, but and every week I bring in scores, and actually I have my score book here. Actually this one's full. I've got another one. So each week I bring in a new set of scores, and the practice ostensibly stays the same. We do what I call a solo warm-up, which I borrowed from an improviser, actually a contact improviser in New York called David Beadle. So we do a solo warm-up, and then we do various things, dancing and watching, and then we kind of come to a group dance. And the scores that I bring in, actually, they take kind of various forms. So this morning, actually, we've had a practice this morning. We had a list of adverbs and a list of verbs that kind of sit next to each other. I'm going to say there's about 20 in each of those lists, and then one can apply to the other. Like, where's today's book? No, I won't look at it now, but like it could be, say, for example, tentatively disrupting, or it could be what was another one? Accelerating falls, or so you could kind of apply. So that's I guess scores for me in the simplest form. But I also do all kinds of things like take text from various people. So a dance scholar like Lawrence Luke, for example, I might take some text. So she's got some writing about weight. Take that, and I take a part and I write it into my book, and then I So I kind of talk about it, give it a bit of context for the dancers who haven't just been reading that text. And then I take phrases out of that material and make them into a list of scores. And then there's one other, I mean, actually there are many kind of versions, but another thing that I like to do is take words and get different definitions of them. So I just Google definition of occupy. And then I find as many definitions as are useful. So it might be, you know, like, you know, a definition of mass, for example. And if it's a very scientific one and it's kind of dry and it's not useful, then I don't kind of bring it into the book. But if it's something that somehow feels like it's generative, then I'll use it. And then the way we dance with those scores is kind of really loose. So for me, I guess I wrote them and I have a particular intention. And I would say at the one end, they support me to generate material. The other end, they might support me to notice in a particular way. And, you know, I probably come in and out of that. And the dancers with whom I work, some of them, you know, would work quite closely. And some of them go, oh, I forgot what the scores were. I've just done this. So we kind of talk about how we dance with the scores, and the scores in a conversation after we've been dancing enable a conversation about our dancing. So it's not the scores themselves that are important, but their kind of facilitation of a conversation about dancing, because we've got something to hold on to. We've got a shared, I guess, set of, I don't know, things, let's say.
Very, very exciting. And I love that. It's a sort of a focused research. Very jealous of the fact that you've had a 10-year lab going on. Wonderful. I was just picking up on the solo warm-up, I think you called it, at the beginning of a session. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Neil. So I did a workshop in, I think, 2003 in New York City. It was one of the movement research workshops with David Beadle, and it was actually contact improvisation workshop, but we started with a solo warm-up, and he talked about it having the elements of lying, rolling, sitting, crawling, standing, walking. So, you know, he said you could really do whatever you want, but they're the kind of basis of those things. And they're the kind of basis of where the movement is generated from, I guess. So you could kind of do anything. And the job of that solo warm-up was both to warm you up, get you prepared, but also to bring you into an improvisational mode, I guess. And so I've got a few hats. So I have my solo practice, but of course I teach quite a lot of undergraduate degrees, and or the undergraduate degree here at Deakin, and I support students in improvisation is quite present, I guess, in that course. And so David Beadle's lying, rolling, you know, sitting, kneeling, etc., is really useful for students who don't have a starting point. But in my weekly practice, because I've been working with many of these dancers for so long, it's not really directed at all. It's just we do the solo warm-up, knowing that it does those two things, warm us up and prepare us to dance. But the other thing I should say about it is it's 9 minutes long, and it's a fake 9 minutes. So it's kind of absurd, but it's something like we go for 9 minutes. At some point I say 5 minutes to go, and then I say 2 minutes to go, and then 1 minute, and then find an end. And it's not 9 minutes. Of course, I'd have no idea how long it is, but usually it's probably about 20 minutes. And the people who, and the people who have worked with me for a while, at some point, one of the dancers said, I know when you say 5 minutes is when you've got something, because, you know, like I might be working with the scores and it takes me a while to kind of find my way in, for example, or get something that I'm really, you know, working with. And then after that, I feel like I can say 5 more minutes, because then I know I've still got 5 minutes. So I'm not halfway through yet. So it might take me a good 15 minutes to get to the 5 more minutes to go. So it's this strange, and, you know, we just named it that, or I named it that, in terms of it being 9 minutes long, but it's kind of fake and arbitrary, but again, something to hold on to so that we kind of know where we are.
Olivia, you mentioned that the warm-up in some ways is a way of becoming available to improvising. I'm wondering what available to improvising means to you as both a facilitator in that context, as a performer, and as a researcher explorer.
So I think I really have noticed a change over the years for me about what that means. I think probably it's similar for lots of people. Early on in my time improvising, I felt like part of my job was to generate material that may be interesting for other people to watch. And, you know, I suppose interesting for myself, but I guess fulfilling a set of expectations in my head about what other people might, you know, need from my. And so probably that's what I thought it was to start off with, somehow about getting into my body so that perhaps the scores that I was working with would help me find a way to be interested, have enough kind of physical, I'm going to say availability, but that's not answering your question. What is it? It's like a kind of a firing from one part of the body to the next, wake myself up. So that would drive me. I think these days I don't really feel a need to impress anybody. You know, I guess you get to some point where it just doesn't really, and I don't perform as much as I used to, I suppose. But I mean, in this context of this practice, I guess we're still performing. But I think these days I'm really interested in falling into finding an interest myself. And sometimes it just takes a bit of time, and it might be just working through some ideas. So I'll give you an example. We were working with the idea of mass, and I'd had lots of kind of definitions of mass, taking up space, etc. And somehow I got to thinking about the density of my own mass, the varying density of my own mass, and how that might affect how I moved. And then I was thinking about, you know, kind of just trying it out in movement, and then how the density of my own mass was higher, I guess, than the air around me. And then somehow I just got to this feeling that because the air was less dense than my body's density, that like I could fall through the air. And then I kind of got into this state where it was like I was moving almost without kind of having to have the impetus myself. It was like the space itself was kind of sucking the movement out of me because it was less dense than my body. So I guess the availability is something about getting into, I guess I'd call it a state, and it could be to do with the scores. And for me, often the scores enable that, but it doesn't need to be. Something about, oh, here I am dancing and I'm really kind of fascinated with this. And it isn't always one thing. Like that example was really like, once I started that, I was really the whole 2 hours, I just, you know, couldn't stop dancing in that way. But other times it might be a combination of things. So it's something about, yeah, finding a way in.
I'm interested in group improvisation, and it'd be lovely to talk about that. I kind of, in some ways, I feel like solo improvisation is kind of pretty straightforward because you're sort of your own thing, and you can do what you want. But then when others get involved, it becomes a lot more complicated, and it can get very messy very quickly. So it'd be interesting to hear about how you approach teaching group improvisation or being in group improvisation.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's I guess one of the other questions that I took up for my PhD. I guess first was about scores. It was about what a work is. And then the third was what makes a group a group. And for me, I suppose let's say the first thing I think about when I'm improvising is generating movement rather than directly forming a relationship with somebody else. And so I've been in other situations, of course. I've been in work with other people where the relationship between the bodies in space, whether that's taking an offer or you know, making spatial or other relationships is primary. I really felt like what we were doing in my PhD project, at least, was working as soloists who were becoming a group over time. So what I was thinking about was the cohesion in the group didn't come because we deliberately aimed to dance in the same way, but through sorry, it's a bit silly, but just go to Bourdieu, like the habitus, the structuring structures. So being in a situation where you're working with people, the structure itself informs how you act, and then that informs how you kind of exist in the structure. So really pretty much it was about dancing and watching, I guess. So we would watch and dance and we're affected by each other so much non-consciously, I guess, a non-conscious appropriation of each other's movement. And then in order to set up a dance, I played with various structures, I guess I would call them. So if scores for me were about the generation of movement, then structures were about kind of holding a group dance. So really, really simple things like I will name the room north, south, east, west, and give half of the dancers are north-south dancers, half of the dancers are east-west dancers, which just means you enter and exit by your side. And what happens is if you're only going north and south, it affects your travel and affects the way you perceive the east-westers. So it's so subtle, but you know, actually I've been doing that for quite a few years. And even when I do it with students, I still find myself, you know, what's my relationship with those? So it just sets up a very simple structure, which is not asking people to respond necessarily to each other, but we do anyway because of the use of the space. Another is numbers. So I like to say, just say there are 15 people in the room. Then I'll say, okay, the number in the space can be 3, 4, 7, 9, or 15. So if there are 9 people in the space and somebody else comes in, then someone has to make a choice to change that. So, and the onus is equally on people both to comply, but also kind of hold their own desire. For example, well, I come in and I've made it 10, but I don't want to leave. So someone else has to leave or some other people have to come in. But, you know, so you're kind of playing with pushing, holding, and going, oh, quick, I've got to come in because it's the wrong number of people in the space. So, yeah, I have lots of relationships like that. This morning we were doing something which we call the maker and the taker. So really that's just one person sometimes copies another person if they want to. And, you know, playing with, I just take a move from somebody or I copy them or, yeah, and so then that starts to affect, again, the spatial relationships with each other because, you know, you end up playing with each other or, you know, traveling together across the space, for example. So they're kind of simple structures that enable those, I guess, like the kind of overall picture of a group dance, knowing as well that the group dance is informed simply by the fact that we are practicing with each other over time.
What you just mentioned about it's sort of like it's invitational, it's sort of strategic, it's a remarkable way of sort of holding the invitation and holding it with intention and asking others to either sort of have a slight meta view of what's happening as well whilst being immersed in. If you're performing solo, I'm wondering how that sits for you, how you attend to sort of the detail of what's happening and whether you do set up scores that are ongoing or how your work emerges when you're performing in a solo context.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I feel like having a weekly practice, and Neil said before that it was a privilege, and I kind of really acknowledge that. It's such a great privileged to work in a university and have space and be able to bring people in. And, you know, I'm so lucky to have a wage, and so I can, you know, kind of hold that, and I just make sure no classes are timetable during that time, you know, so it is a great privilege. But I feel like that work supports, you know, say, for example, if I were to have a solo performance. So I feel like I've got this ongoing practice, which then I really sit on heavily, if that makes sense, in any other kind of context. And so, say, for example, if I were to do a half-hour solo, which I did last year with Emily and Joey's The Bill, and half an hour is quite a long time. Yeah. So I certainly would say, okay, to myself, set some time to practice for half an hour. And so I kind of remember what that means. I mean, practice solo. So usually I would pick some scores out of my book that have been really useful for me, but then as well, probably over a period of time like that, go, okay, there's a chronological kind of setup that I'm going to do. I'm going to do this score first, and then I'll see, and I'll do this score. And I would say for the most part, that doesn't happen. But I would set it up so that I've got that to support me. And acknowledging too that the body changes over time, or my body changes over time. So I kind of perceive myself in a different way. And so then, you know, sometimes you kind of, they're working, and then at some point you kind of go through something and you come out the other side, and then more things become noticeable to you. So yeah, on the one hand, giving myself a bit of a backup, but then on the other hand, being willing to let that go if, yeah, well, assuming that something else, yeah, is there.
Interested in the well, let's take the example of the solo performance, and maybe you could anchor the thinkings around that performance with Emily and Joey. Even the difference between doing a half an hour on your own in the studio and a half an hour in front of an audience. Unpack maybe how that feels different to you.
So the weight of an audience, of course, and the situation in which it exists is significant. In terms of the space, even, you know, who the people might be attending. I would say that there's a kind of a thickening, or like an aliveness that comes about through being watched and through being in that situation. I would say that these days I feel lucky enough to be able to enjoy rather than to worry. I don't think, you know, I spend too much time thinking, oh, you know, am I doing a good job? Yeah, it's not because I'm doing a better job than I was before, I think, but more, you know, I think I'm less invested in what people think about me, which is great because it kind of frees the possibilities, I think, because, well, I mean, I'm sure everyone probably agrees that kind of mentality of the need to produce is really just kind of shutting down rather than opening up. So I guess, I mean, I practice in front of people a lot because part of my group practice is we dance for each other. So I feel like I'm watched quite a lot. What else can I say that's useful about that? You know, different circumstances as well. So I haven't talked about this yet today, but maybe it's good to talk about the group About Now that I've worked with. So with Sean McLeod and Peter Fraser and Jason Martin, and we've done quite a few different performances over 10 years. And we often perform in a public space, sometimes with incidental audience, or an outside space with dedicated audience members. But those kind of performance situations are quite different, say, to performing at Dance House, for example, because, you know, the public has a kind of a wavering attention, I guess. And so for me, that, you know, is, I guess, freeing in a way, and gives me more scope to kind of take my surroundings, or I guess my intention in terms of, you know, movement generation into account a bit more. I don't think I am really kind of fed by being watched in the way some people might be. Of course I love performing, and but it's I guess it's not my primary driver. I think my primary driver is the dancing itself.
Olivia, when you mentioned about performing now and caring maybe somewhat less about the outcome or the form, it's sort of somehow liberating, really liberating in some ways to hear those words. And I start to think of the word play, and I'm also interested in the research and interest you have around your AllPlay Dance program. I came across a quote yesterday, a really simple one, which was, "Modernity is the enemy of play." And I'm so interested in play in terms of availability to the moment, and just to spontaneous responses and less sort of censored ways of being. Can you chat about your work with AllPlay and working with that as research, and what is happening there and what intrigues you around that?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So the AllPlay program actually was set up by a group of psychologists looking at the benefits for varying activities, actually, for children with disability. They started with AFL footy, and then dance came into it subsequently, and they also have AllPlay Learn. So the broad idea behind the program is to support children with disability in participating in activities in the community, which may be beneficial to them, even therapeutic for them, but rather than them being kind of therapy programs, they're participating in activities that already exist in the community. So my work started in AllPlay Dance in about 2018, and we worked with a group of children with cerebral palsy, and I was kind of brought into the project as a dance person. And I suppose I was going to be the dance teacher on the project. And I had worked a little bit, I'd worked with Weave Movement Theatre, I'd worked with the Delta Project, which was a project for dancers, deaf and hearing dancers in Melbourne as well. But I guess I was kind of the dance teacher, and I had a bit of a think about how to make this work. And of course, the first thing that came to me was to use improvisation as a way to enable children with cerebral palsy to have agency in the way that they dance. So we ran that program, and it turned out to be quite successful in that the students could, or the dancers could, join in on their own terms. So we had children in wheelchairs, we had children who were on walkers, children who mostly were in wheelchairs, but they came out for that dance program so they could dance on the floor. And following that, we did a bigger project with children with autism. So we were starting to measure the benefits. So the psychology people do the pre and post testing. You know, I do the more dance studies, open-ended kind of thinking about what's going on. But we did this program with children with autism, again, measuring the benefits. So, you know, they did some quite particular tests to measure motor skill development, but also like well-being. And then there was all of the kind of qualitative data around what the children had to say, what their parents had to say. We had buddies who were older and more experienced dancers. But what I really found in that project was there were quite a few parents who came in and said, our child can't participate in dance programs in the community because we've tried, and dance teachers have said, we don't feel like we have the capacity to teach them because we don't know enough, we're frightened, etc. So I kind of turned it around. In the last couple of years, we've been running programs which are like professional development programs for dance teachers in the community, in private dance schools. Also with Queensland Ballet, we've done it so that then children can come. And what we're hoping is eventually anywhere in any kind of, you know, area in Australia, a child with a disability can participate in a program at their local dance school and have the benefits of that. And for me, the kind of cornerstone is improvisation, actually. So that's partly why we have been running these professional development programs, both to give them the information about what a child, say, for example, with autism might need in terms of support. But also, what I found is a lot of teachers in community schools teach codified steps, whatever they are, jazz, tap, ballet, whatever it is. And so to bring improvisation in, and, you know, it's not useful to come in and say, we'll just improvise with them. But actually what we've done is say, so I've introduced, for example, the way I use scores and how to get going. We've brought in ideas from Laban's movement analysis, those kinds of things, so that then they have the tools to generate programs so that children can participate in their own terms, but also that it can be rigorous. Like there's development over time. There's a possibility to create dances that can find their way into performances, for example. So yeah, that's the work we're doing, and it's a great joy actually to be able to bring dance, but also improvisation into a context that it's really supporting people in the community in a way that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't have been supported.
Olivia, I'm interested in the word, you mentioned the word rigorous before. And I find everything that you're speaking about in a way, and how you approach improvisation in that broader sense, is seen to be sort of well imbued with an element of rigor as well as sort of more open-ended availability. And that, let's call it, you know, the dance between those two, or the inclusivity of those two elements of being, it feels very, very integral to your work and quite vital. Could you talk a little bit more about rigor and whatever the opposite of rigor is?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate that you picked that up, because I think that is really important. On the one hand, I'm really interested in, say, both in my own practice, but also, say, for example, in the work that I'm doing in AllPlay Dance, in enabling people to make choices about how they participate, how they dance, the kind of dance they do, even to break the rules as necessary. You know, I don't want to be north-south, I want to be southeast, or, you know, whatever, you know, I choose not to use scores today because they're not interesting, or, you know, but I also feel so strongly about finding a way for dance improvisation, or let's say non-codified dance more broadly, to be something that is just as kind of valuable. I apologize about my email. Just as valuable, but also as I guess a platform for development as the more conventional dance forms, where we might know that you start here and you end up doing a triple pirouette or whatever it is. And I guess that's one of the premises that I'm thinking about, both in terms of, say, for example, when I'm working with undergraduate students, but also working in the community, that dance improvisation isn't kind of an easy option. It's full of the capacity to think through our bodies. It's full of, I guess, intersubjective relationships, which allow ourselves to kind of know ourselves and each other in the world. It's about working at something in a very particular way in order to get somewhere with that thing. But it's also, I guess, about doing it on one's own terms. So for me, the kind of, I don't know if it's a paradox, or the kind of sitting of those things next to each other, which is really both important to me, but I think so fascinating as well. Yeah, gives us freedom to go further in a way than a finite, this is what is good. You know, it's like we don't know what's what's interesting yet because we haven't found it, or we know this is interesting, but there are so many other things that might be, or, you know, exciting or full of possibilities.
I was thinking to ask what do you think makes a good improvisation, which I guess segues into the notion of codified work or quantifiable practices. You can get the sense of good being better. You can do 3 pirouettes rather than 2. Improv is a very slippery thing in that way. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about good improvisation, if that means anything.
I mean, it's such an interesting question, isn't it? Because I guess I feel like it's possible to see when a performer, for example, has a lot of experience and is able to follow instincts and interests in the present, whatever they may be, whether it's in relation to others or one's self. But it's also true that I think people who are very new to improvisation, or, you know, young people, can also be incredible improvisers. I suppose I would say that I think practice is incredibly important, but then that's just contradicting what I just said. A willingness to okay, I have one thing that I want to say, which I think is useful, which is about habit. And so I hear a lot, particularly students, say, I want to get away from my habits. Part of improvising, oh, I'm sick of doing the same thing. Why do I always do the same thing? My job in improvising is to do something different. And I feel like I have a contrary opinion to that, which is I feel like habit is incredibly useful and supportive, but can also be really beautiful. And that kind of leaning on habit, or our kind of go-to what are they, tropes, or whatever it is that we do in our can be something to sit on in order to find new possibilities in the present. And I suppose because I've been practicing for so long in the same way, that I feel like practicing in the same way very regularly tells me something about what's possible against the sameness. So whereas if I were just to, I don't know, turn up in the studio once every 2 months and go, what am I doing? Then, you know, am I doing my 2022 habits? Or, you know, so there's something about the kind of regularity of practice which offers possibility. Having said that, I don't think I could see someone perform, you know, as an audience member and know how much they've practiced. So, and you know, that's not really a measure, I suppose, of a good improviser. So I don't think I've answered your question really exactly.
I think you've answered it perfectly. Brilliant. It's yeah, we often, you know, in these podcasts, people often talk about practice, the importance of practice, and I love the idea of pressing into habit or attending to your habits. The idea of having something to push against, something you can dialogue against, some kind of resistance almost that you can work with, so that sort of paradoxical mix of freedom and form. I think habit, I'm not sure what the opposite of habit is, but that, you know, it's in that zone. Yeah, great. Thank you, Kevin. I think we've got to let Olivia go. Unfortunately, thank you so much for your time today. We could talk for another hour, I'm sure. So intriguing, so interesting, so inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Olivia, thank you as well for what you've offered this morning. I just love the way you're fairly constantly speaking of relationality being relational to, I guess, our immediate experiencing moving, relational to scores that you might be using, relational to others. So it feels like a really immersed, engaged, relational practice. And I love the way you speak of sort of intersubjective meetings and how, I guess, performing and being together in a studio in some ways parallels simply being in the world with others, which we are embedded all of the time. So thank you for your reflections on your practice. I'm sure they're going to be so interesting to so many. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.